How do Canadians feel about Facebook? I'm Marco Perry. Welcome to the Perry Platform. Ledger and the Association for Canadian Studies conducted a poll to gauge how Canadians are feeling right now about Facebook. The poll was quite particular. It didn't talk about social media as a whole, and it's unclear if every question meant Facebook and its subsidiaries or just Facebook, because as you probably already know, Facebook owns applications like Instagram and WhatsApp. If this poll was trying to gauge how toxic and how poisonous a platform is, in this realm of social media, I wouldn't actually say Facebook is the worst. It's bad in its own ways, but for the average person, something like Twitter and TikTok, to me, at least at first glance, I might put them higher up on that list. Studies have also shown that if you are a young girl in particular, a platform like Instagram is arguably the worst one for you. The psychological harm and mental health damage that is performed on there just isn't good, and young women seem to be the most susceptible to that. But anyways, the topic today is Facebook, and we might weave in those subsidiaries as we see fit. I want to bring up the questions that were asked in the poll, go over the findings from the Canadian sample, and also respond with how I would have if I was presented with this survey. So, first question, or the first result / question. About half of respondents say Facebook should be regulated or broken up. Now, the first thing that comes to my mind is I hate it when a question amalgamates two very different things into one and tries to gauge the sentiment as if it's a uniform thing. Being regulated itself is already complicated. What do you mean by that? Being broken up is quite a different outcome. They're not the same thing, so how they can be bundled together, it may cause more confusion than enlightenment. What if of that 50% of respondents, 48% were in favor of regulation, but because it has the or, you added on an additional 2% because of the broken up segment? These honestly deserve their own question. I mean, the more precise you can be, the better it is, and that's a general rule of thumb for surveys. Now, if I had to answer this, I would have to think about it for a second. When it comes to regulation and even being broken up, people usually tend to picture a best case scenario. If someone were to ask me, what should we do with Facebook? Should we regulate them? When I think about what that means, I'm probably thinking about Facebook becoming this great platform where hurt feelings are minimized while freedom of speech is still retained, and all of these other dynamics. And for being broken up, we're picturing equally competitive subsidiaries arising and no economic turmoil befalling us. But in reality, regulation and breaking up, they're only as good as the strategy. And what we know of the current government and their ineptitude when it comes to big tech, it doesn't give me much confidence here. They've already tried, especially in Canada, to regulate the internet and social media. And what always comes out of that type of plan are crackdowns on expression and free speech. Tried to bring in these frivolous categorizations of hate speech and what that means and hurt feelings and all these things. And along the way, concerns of privacy breaches and all of that come up too. On one hand, there's the theoretical. In the abstract, maybe I can understand the need for further regulations, but pragmatically, when we look at the agents who would carry that out, I just don't trust them to do a good job. So when I say perhaps they should be regulated, I'm imagining a better entity being in charge of that. The current offerings would give me pause. And the same can be said about breaking it up. If you do that, there's a question of what comes out of it. What comes out of the void if you divide Facebook up? How would you even do such a thing? Would you take half the users of Facebook and port them over to Bookface and have them interact there as if it was the same thing, but the audience is split? And what if some of the contacts they want to talk to are residing on the other platform? Or how will this work? Once again, in the abstract, there could be an argument for it, but for me to really sign off on a regulation plan or a plan to break them up, some antitrust type of notions, it would have to come with a full description of what that entails. Perhaps this is a more broad lesson to ask more questions about terminologies that are being thrown around and to get the meat and potatoes of certain plans. All too often, I feel like we agree to things that sound good without carefully analyzing the aftermath. You can fully recognize that there might be or there are problems here, but you can still hold, on the other hand, that solutions are oftentimes complicated. And a bad solution can oftentimes lead to a worse outcome than doing nothing. So, the next question now. They're trying to gauge how much of a population percentage have a negative opinion of the company, Facebook. And the answer, 40%. 40% of Canadians have a negative view of the entity. I think that's fair. Me, I probably would have a neutral viewpoint because I do see the benefit and I do see the negative. The onslaught of fake news and all of that driving the pandemic for longer than it has had to be in. But at the same time, an easy tool for connection, talking to people around the world, especially if we're adding in these subsidiaries of Facebook, like WhatsApp, connecting families. So while there is bad, there is some good. To be in the fully negative camp, I would say that as a whole, I regard social media as a whole as a negative, but within the individual companies, there's more gray area as to what they do and what they offer society. Now, here's an interesting one. The majority of the respondents agree that Facebook amplifies hate speech, helps spread fake news, damages individuals' mental health, and poses a risk to children and teenagers. The first thing I'll say right off the bat, if we're talking about children and teenagers, the greatest threats to their well-being is not Facebook. Arguably, it could be the subsidiary, their Instagram, or it could be TikTok. Not so much Snapchat. And these are the more popular social media platforms used by children and teens. They're not all biting at the bit to get onto Facebook. In some ways, Facebook has become something more prominent among millennials and those who are a little bit older. The youth are really captured by these other applications, and they're causing far more harm than what Facebook's doing, for sure. I have no doubt about that. So for there, I would have to disagree. If they're trying to gauge the most harmful thing, of course, Facebook can still pose a risk, but if we're looking at all the risk holistically, there has to be a hierarchy there. Now, the point about damaging individuals' mental health, once again, I do think other platforms are probably worse offenders, but Facebook, I can see why. The rationale for that would probably tie into the other points it made, such as the spread of fake news, your mind is being overflown with information, some of it misinformation. And now, the point about hate speech, there's no denying there is hateful speech on social media. But the way hate speech has usually been used is as some type of legal terminology, something that you can be held accountable to under the law. If we're simply saying that there is speech imbued with hatred, angry people talking, then there is no denying this. But if we're using the term as some type of standard, that's where I have issue akin to what Jordan Peterson laid out. How can one define this in any rational way? The answer is there truly isn't, because we're talking about the realm of emotion now. And quantifying that is impossible. Unless you want to say that anything that offends is hate speech, then you're out of luck there. And there are people who do want to go with that definition, and they're not seeing the slippery slope, because offense truly is subjective. And when those among us are free to determine consequences based on the ways in which they're interpreting, not based on what the intention of the sayer was saying, how they interpreted it is being used as the basis for punishment, we're ending up in some witch trial society. So here I will agree that Facebook can amplify hatred online. Sure, any platform can do that. It's social media as a whole. There are perhaps things that can be done to mitigate that though. One of the problems with the online interaction space is that we're not actually face to face, and that might sound obvious, but it's a seldom recognized fact. When we're talking to people in person, there's a plethora of consequences that come with what you say. First of all, saying something that can be deemed offensive might result in an altercation that you don't want. It could result in hurt feelings that you don't want to see. Having someone reduce to tears in front of you because you were being mean doesn't feel that great. But behind a screen, you're actually removed from every consequence of what you've said. In real life, there is no such thing. Consequences befall you immediately. Having that separation between cause and effect, it's leading to this perversion of online interaction where people are saying whatever they want, even if it's harmful, because they're not experiencing any of the feedback there. Now, perhaps some of the remedy for that is verifying people, having your identity tied to your account. Perhaps it's also a cultural thing where we simply have to establish societal norms for ourselves and to discuss how one should really be behaving online. Keep in mind, this technology is new. This playing field is something novel. In some sense, you can regard it as a grand psychological experiment. Social media was thrust onto the population at large without much of an understanding for what it would do. And we're seeing the consequences now. The polarization, the confusion, the anger, the hatred, the fake news, and all of that. It's a problem attributable to social media as a whole. Facebook certainly plays its part, and with that, we can move on to the next thing now. So, 3 in 4 respondents believe that the social network Facebook helps them stay connected to their loved ones, and that's a good thing. I think that's true. Well, I actually do wonder what the other 25% of people believe. They think that Facebook does not help them stay connected to their loved ones. Well, why are they on there then? To take part in the outrage machine? I mean, this is the point that keeps people on there, I think, for the most part. Being able to, quickly contact people who you're familiar with. And if we take it back to these subsidiaries again, WhatsApp and Instagram do that as well. Never before has there been this opportunity. At the click of a button, you can talk to someone across the world. You can shoot them a message without having to have a phone plan. It's free. Well, if you have internet, it is, and a phone. But still, a cheap, efficient, sometimes fun way to keep in touch. That's one of the positives and one of the beauties of the technology. We talked about the negatives, so it's only fair that we also look at one of the more promising aspects here. So, the next question, interesting as well. Over 50% of respondents say that Facebook is key to sharing information and it's positive for free expression. Very interesting. It certainly is key for sharing information. You might recall that prior to the internet and social media, there's only very select ways for you to become informed, and even fewer convenient ways to become informed. One of these ways was you could go to the library, take out encyclopedias, and learn about stuff. There's a high opportunity cost there because a lot of time has to be involved. You physically have to go somewhere. Then, alternatively, you could tune into your TV station. But here you'd be at the mercy of corporate media. The Fox Newses, the CNNs, the MSBCs, whatever. In Canada, the CBCs, CTVs, all of these entities. Now, as we've come to realize, a lot of these entities have an agenda. Objective journalism has gone the way of the dodo. So, this lack of freedom, in some sense, presented to them an oligopoly situation, where communication, information, the means of crafting narratives was all in their hand. So, when social media comes into the fray, and it distributes that power to average people, it decentralizes the flow of information. Of course, they were angry about that. Now, in theory, that would be a good thing. Because now, if you do uphold free speech and expression, there are more channels that can battle each other, and from that you'll get the best ones who survive. This battle may still very well be playing itself out as we see declines in traditional media sources and things like Substack picking up. But within this battlefield, there are pathogens that are not good, unintended, things that were non-foreseeable. Such as the way the system works where it's incentivizing polarization because we want engagement on social media. Where, sure, everyone has a platform now, but the average citizen may not have been able to determine which platforms are actually better than others objectively, where people have fallen prey to illicit behavior and fake news and all these things that were used as tactics to draw in their attention. With the corporate media, it was centralized, but at least you knew what you were getting. It was, although tainted with agendas, still they were held to some relative standard. The decentralization that we're seeing on social media, these standards don't truly exist. It's the Wild West in some sense, and that could be an issue that has to be tackled at some point. But right now, things are a bit crazy. So I would agree that it is key to sharing information, but it's also key to sharing misinformation. That's just a fact that has to be accounted for. And while I do agree it's positive for free expression, we're having talks right now at the governmental level about curbing that. So there's a bit of a mixed bag here and many things to consider. And finally, the last poll item I want to talk about. 1 in 5 respondents had a positive view of Facebook co-founder and CEO Mark Zuckerberg. Honestly, I don't really care about Zuckerberg that much. I think there's a false realization here where people think a lot of the grave ills of social media are attributable to Mark himself. Where, the way I see it, if you were to pluck him out and insert any other CEO, not much would change. Facebook would still scalp your data, and they might even do it more often. Facebook would still be taking part in this polarization Olympic. Why? Well, that's just the business model. That's how they make their money. And the job of the CEO is to ensure these revenue streams are upheld. Or, conversely, to find new ones that are better. And Facebook is a large data broker. What exactly do we think would be different? That's all just to say that it's hard to form a positive or negative opinion of Mark Zuckerberg when looking at his business practices, because I just see the business practices as staples for that CEO role. Now, if you know things about Mark's personal history, which I don't really know much about, I know very little about this individual, then perhaps that can be influencing you. If you know that Mark Zuckerberg likes pineapple on pizza and you hate that, then maybe that's influencing the positive, negative view, or anything of that nature. But yeah, I don't know what I would say about that. Do I have a positive or negative view of Mark? It would be neutral. I don't have one or the other. I have a positive and negative view of the company and the various aspects of it. Same for the larger social media playing field. But the individuals within the company, not so much. They all amalgamate to create the culture of Facebook. To conclude here, to me it's clear that people are becoming more upset with these tools like Facebook. They're recognizing the issues with them, but doing something about it is where the challenge arises. What can you do, really? Maybe that ties back to the oligopoly situation where there isn't much competition. It's either Facebook or Instagram, which they own, and then if you really don't want to dabble in those, you have Twitter, which is a little bit different, the big three. In some ways, it feels like people are searching for an alternative, and to me, it's just not clear if that's the answer, to find a new platform that will have better incentives for people. Surely that would play a role. It could be part of the equation. To me, though, one has to look at themselves as well, and to understand the behaviors that they've contributed to the polarization atmosphere. Because another possibility here is that no matter what platform we find ourselves on, people are going to pollute it with toxicity. Regardless of whatever incentives you might concoct, there might be that element there at play. Now, to tackle that, it requires these cultural shifts, to change the ways in which we view dichotomies, to change the ways in which we view the current political and social landscape, to have these internalized pillars of society and how we're seeing each other. To me, correcting that might fix many of the issues that we're currently dealing with as a byproduct anyways. So, time will tell how this experiment of social media plays out, but it is clear that people are starting to become less infatuated with the current offerings. Now, with that, it does bring us to the end of our conversation for today. If you enjoyed the content, be sure to leave a review and share. That'll help us grow. And you can find me online at perryplatform.org and on social media at perryplatform. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you soon.